Every morning begins the same way, yet no two mornings ever feel alike. That was what Diem realized on a quiet dawn when the sky was still pale and the air carried the faint chill of unfinished dreams. She stood in the small yard, pulling weeds from the damp ground, her hands moving mechanically while her mind wandered far away, far beyond the narrow paths of the village, far beyond the place where Toan had once stood beside her. She greeted the day softly, as if speaking to unseen listeners, thanking life for letting her wake up once more. Gratitude had become her habit, perhaps her shield. Even when her heart felt heavy, she still chose to be gentle with the world. Around her, life continued in its ordinary rhythm, the pot of porridge simmering for the old woman inside the house, the rustling of leaves, the distant sound of footsteps heading to work. Everything looked peaceful, too peaceful for a heart that refused to settle. Toan had vanished without explanation. No farewell, no message, only silence stretching from one day to the next, slowly turning into fear. People said he was a CEO, a man with responsibilities and a future that moved faster than ordinary lives. But to Diem, he was simply the man who once promised to come back. And promises, once broken, leave echoes that hurt more than words. The old woman worried about her health, urging her to rest, to eat, to stop thinking so much. Others tried to help in their own ways, asking around, making phone calls, suggesting patience. Diem listened, nodded, smiled. Yet deep inside, she knew waiting was the hardest thing she had ever done. Waiting meant imagining every possible ending. Waiting meant reliving memories that felt warm and cruel at the same time. That morning, as she wiped her hands on her worn sleeves, a quiet decision formed within her. If answers would not come to her, she would go and look for them herself, even if the roads were long, even if the truth might hurt, even if, in the end, she would find nothing at all. Because some journeys are not about being found. They are about proving that love once existed and that it was real enough to be searched for again and again. And so, Diem took her first step, unaware that fate was already watching, silently deciding whether this search would end in reunion or in another kind of goodbye. The road stretched forward in quiet defiance, long and uneven, much like Lytudiep's thoughts. Each step she took felt heavier than the last, not because of the distance, but because of the questions pressing against her heart. Where had Toan gone? Was he still in this country, breathing the same air, walking under the same sky? Or had he already crossed an ocean, leaving her behind without even realizing it? She walked past familiar houses and unfamiliar faces, her eyes searching for meaning in every small detail. A construction site stood silent under the sun, its gates half open, dust settling where voices and machines once filled the air. Toan used to come to places like this, checking progress, speaking calmly with workers, standing tall in his crisp shirt that never seemed to collect dirt. Now there was only emptiness. The workers, she asked, shook their heads. Some had not seen him in weeks. Others barely remembered his name. Each answer felt like a soft denial, not loud enough to break her, but steady enough to wear her down. By noon, hunger crept in quietly. She had skipped breakfast, telling herself she would eat later, as if later were guaranteed. Her body felt weak, but her mind refused to stop. She remembered the old woman's worried eyes, the money pressed into her palm with trembling hands, the words spoken like a blessing, "Eat when you're hungry. Don't push yourself too hard." Kindness, she realized, often came from strangers and half-strangers, people who owed her nothing yet offered her everything they could. At a small roadside shop, she bought the simplest things, a carton of milk, a cheap snack. She sat there for a moment, watching life pass by. Children cried for toys. A motorbike roared past, carrying someone in a hurry. A woman counted change carefully before handing it over. Ordinary scenes, ordinary worries. Yet in that ordinariness, Lytudiep felt a strange comfort. The world had not stopped, even if her heart felt suspended in time. Still, doubt followed her like a shadow. What if Toan had chosen to disappear? What if his silence was not an accident, but a decision? The thought tightened her chest, but she forced herself to keep walking, because turning back without answers felt more painful than moving forward without hope. As the sun lowered, her steps slowed. Fatigue seeped into her bones, yet her resolve remained stubbornly alive. Somewhere out there, she believed, the truth was waiting, whether it came in the form of Toan's return or the acceptance that some people are only meant to stay for a season. And so she continued, walking between faith and fear, unaware that every unanswered question was shaping her into someone stronger than she had ever been before. Evening arrived quietly, as if it did not want to disturb Lytudiep's fragile thoughts. The sky softened into shades of orange and gray, and with it came the kind of tiredness that reached far deeper than the body. Her feet ached, her shoulders felt heavy, yet the weight in her chest was still the hardest to carry. She returned to the small house where the lights were already on, glowing faintly like a promise of safety. The old woman looked up the moment she heard the door, worry etched into every line on her face. No questions were asked at first. Instead, there was a warm bowl of food waiting, a gentle voice telling her to wash her hands, to sit down, to breathe. In that silence, Lytudiep felt something she had almost forgotten during the long walk. She was not alone. As she ate, the world slowed. The clink of chopsticks, the steam rising from the bowl, the simple taste of home-cooked food, all of it reminded her of ordinary evenings she once shared with Toan. Back then, time had seemed generous. They talked about small things, laughed over nothing, made plans that felt certain simply because they believed in them. Now, those memories felt like fragile glass, beautiful but painful to touch. Later, she stepped outside again, drawn by the sound of water and the calm of the night. Near the quiet pond, she picked up an old fishing rod, unsure why she felt the urge to try. Maybe she needed to feel patient again. Maybe she needed to believe that waiting could still lead to something. She cast the line gently, watching the ripples spread and disappear. Time passed unnoticed, until suddenly the line tightened. The fish was larger than she expected. For a brief moment, excitement replaced sorrow. She laughed softly, breathless, as she pulled it in. It was a small victory, meaningless to the world, yet precious to her. Holding the fish, she felt alive again, capable again. Not everything she reached for slipped away. That night, the fire crackled as the fish roasted slowly. The smell filled the air, warm and comforting. The old woman smiled, praising her, telling her to eat more, to regain her strength. Lytudiep listened, her eyes moist, but her heart steadier than before. Toan was still missing. The answers were still nowhere to be found. But in that moment, surrounded by simple care and quiet warmth, she understood something important. Even when love disappears without explanation, life continues to offer small mercies. And perhaps, she thought, as she stared into the fading embers, fate was not finished with her yet. Night deepened, wrapping the small house in a quiet that felt both comforting and uncertain. Outside, the village settled into sleep, but inside, Lytudiep's mind remained awake, wandering through memories she could neither erase nor fully embrace. The fire had burned low, leaving behind glowing embers, much like the feelings she carried for Toan, no longer blazing yet far from extinguished. Later that evening, a simple meal brought calm to the room. The old woman spoke gently, her voice steady and reassuring, as if she believed words alone could protect the fragile heart before her. She reminded Lytudiep that some answers take time, and some paths only reveal themselves when one stops forcing the journey. Lytudiep listened, nodding softly, though her thoughts drifted elsewhere, to roads she had walked, to doors she had knocked on, to faces that shook their heads in quiet apology. When the night grew colder, she stepped outside once more. The stars were scattered across the sky, distant yet constant. She wondered if Toan, wherever he was, ever looked up at the same stars. Did he think of her in moments of silence, or had life already carried him too far away to remember? The questions returned, familiar and relentless, but this time they no longer crushed her. Life, she realized, was made of these very moments, uncertain endings, unfinished conversations, and days that moved forward whether the heart was ready or not. Every morning, people woke up to routines they did not choose: cooking meals, going to work, caring for loved ones, hiding private pain behind polite smiles. Her story was not so different. It only felt heavier because love had once made it feel light. Before going to bed, Lytudiep folded her clothes neatly, a small act of order in a world that felt unsteady. She lay down, listening to the quiet breathing of the house, and allowed herself one final thought of Toan, not as the man who disappeared, but as the man who had once stood beside her, real and warm. Perhaps fate would give them a second chance, or perhaps fate's lesson was not about reunion, but about endurance. As sleep slowly claimed her, one truth settled gently in her heart. Even if this journey ended without finding Toan, it would not be meaningless, because every step she took, every tear she held back, every kindness she received had reshaped her. And somewhere between loss and hope, Lytudiep continued living, quietly, bravely, waiting not just for Toan, but for whatever tomorrow chose to bring.